Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, we seldom slip outside of the war, but George Lee's war and the story goes from the 1930s as a regular infantryman right the way through to being a battalion CO at Arnhem and then on to great success with the SAS and other units in Malaya and Borneo and other post-war adventures. Rupert Hague-Holmes joins me now to talk about the Soldiers General, and links to the book are, of course, in the description below or wherever you get your books. I'll bring Rupert in now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Good evening, Paul. Evening, everyone. Very well, thanks.
So we kind of were chatting for 10 minutes before we went live there. I mean, this is one of those stories that covers lots of eras, lots of campaigns, multiple units, multiple ways of going to war. You do lots of military lecturing online, in person, talks, things like that. How did you discover this amazing story, and what wanted you to propel you to write a book about it?
So the genesis of the George Lee story was really a presentation I was asked to give to the Army Benevolent Fund in Jersey, where I live, and where George lived for the last 15 years of his life and where he died, where I was asked to present on Jerseymen who'd fought at Arnhem. Which was quite a difficult ask, actually, because there aren't any easily available records that actually show all the men who had Jersey connections who fought in Arnhem. But I did manage to work out that there was a chap called George Lee who commanded the 11th Parachute Battalion at Arnhem. And then when I started looking at him a bit more closely, realized he became a knighted 3-star general and actually had achieved a huge amount after the war. And actually, when I looked at it, when I started looking at the history of it, I thought, here's a guy that's actually achieved a huge amount, but not really been given the credit for it. And that really was the momentum or the drive behind writing the book.
And as we just talking about, obviously the viewers don't know that, it's that momentum and carrying forward of some of the ideas in the Second World War to that post-war era where in some cases they kind of cured the problems that had been holding them back in World War II, in that all these newfangled things of deploying people by air, by glider, long range, which all came about very quickly. But the war ended in some ways before they'd been the faults have been ironed out, so to speak. But because he went on to the post-war career, they were to some extent. Anyway, I'll bring up your slide. So, folks, if you have any particular questions relating to stuff on screen, do drop them in the sidebar there. But I'm going to hand over to Rupert to take us through this. And yeah, we're venturing out of World War II after the first part of the talk, so I'm looking forward to it. Pasture's new for me.
Absolutely. So a bit of bravery here. We're going outside World War II, but I will spend a bit of time talking about Arnhem, because George Lee's Arnhem was, like probably many officers at his level or more senior, was a disaster, really, and one that he thought would end his career. And as I go on to describe, actually, he needn't have worried. He was of sufficient caliber that the Army recognised his talents post-war, putting him in command of 22 SAS in Malaya, and then a key role, a very politically delicate campaign in Borneo, which he carefully managed through to its conclusion. So here's what I'm going to cover tonight. I'm not going to spend much time on the early years. I really just want to show you how certain influences were formative in developing him as a person, and in particular to the person who became the Soldiers General. I'm then going to spend a bit of time talking about his time in 151 Parachute Battalion in Delhi, where he was the first adjutant and helped Sir Martin Lindsay establish that battalion, and the issues, the problems around that, and then the move to the Middle East when they became 156 Parachute Battalion. I'm then going to switch quite quickly into the SAS stuff and the Special Forces stuff. And Paul, you rightly point out that there are some things that pull through from the Second World War into Special Forces work in the Malayan jungle, although there were some key differences as well. I'm then going to cover some pretty key appointments that George had post the SAS and his DSO that he got for that. And I think probably a real recognition that they had a very capable officer within their ranks, where he was put into Africa to manage the military side of the the breakup of the Central African Federation, very politically sensitive for the reasons I'll come on to. And then Borneo, as I've already mentioned, the Claret operations, the political sensitivities around that, which George was carrying all the responsibility for. And then his final role in Washington as head of the British Defence Staff at a key time when the Americans were locked in the Vietnam War. And for reasons that I will explain, George played an important political and diplomatic role out there. And then finally, George, the very reluctant civilian, he really didn't enjoy being a civilian at all. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I think that's probably the case with most military people, isn't it? They struggle the transition into the civilian world. And George is no different. And then lastly, just a few things to wrap up on the legacy. So that's the framework. As I said, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on his formative years, but I do want to just illustrate for you the influence that his mother had on him. She was so George was born in 1912 into a pretty Victorian middle-class family in Kidderminster in Worcestershire. The family were carpet weavers and had been for centuries, so they were reasonably well off, but not aristocratically wealthy. But his mother was the most interesting character because she was well ahead of her time. So in the 1920s, she was a celebrated poet. She'd won poetry competitions, and in particular, she was a subscribing member of the Spectator magazine, which just didn't happen in those days. And in particular, had written a letter to the editor of the Spectator magazine complaining that a book review on a crime novel had revealed the whodunit, which she thought was most inappropriate, and wasn't shy in coming forward and telling the editor. So she was a strong personality and a big influence in George's early years, and very much followed her son with reverence, really, and in a way helped me. And the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about her, she helped me write the book, but she kept copious notes of his life, with letters and communications, telegrams, etc., etc. So that was the formative side of it. And then George, as a young man, went to Charterhouse. That was a family tradition in the Lea family for centuries. The Lea boys have been going to Charterhouse. But the important thing about this is George was not academic. So it's a very interesting thing. I think there's a parallel here with Winston Churchill. He wasn't academic at all and really struggled at Harrow. George struggled academically at Charterhouse. He was not academic, and he actually really struggled and was almost on the point of being sent away. But he was very good with his fists. He knew how to look after himself, and boxing, in a way, was how George really developed his personality at Charterhouse. The picture you can see him ring there. He's in the school boxing team at the age of 15, which is young. In those days, school boxing was 3 bouts, and it was rather like P Company milling. You just get in there and you get stuck in. George was a slow starter, another aspect of his character. Not academic, slow starter, and invariably would struggle in the first round and then get the measure, being quite tall for his age. And he became a very big man in his adult life, 6'4". He started to get the measure of his opponent and then usually would deliver the knockout blow in the final third round. And as I said, was sufficiently good enough to get his school colours at a young age. So boxing, physical contests and resilience were certainly aspects of his character. He went through Sandhurst, and again, I'm afraid, this is quite interesting, isn't it? It became a 3-star knighted lieutenant general, but was very bottom quartile in the pass out of Sandhurst, to the extent he wanted to join the Worcestershire Regiment, which was his county regiment, but there were only 2 slots available in his intake, and George unfortunately passed out so low out that those were already taken by 2 other young gentlemen cadets. So he had to settle for the Lancashire Fusiliers, but actually in a way suited him. A good family regiment with a good boxing pedigree, and George gets commissioned in 1933. And the army he joins in 1933 is, in many ways, an army that's descaling still from the First World War. And it really was, this is, of course, the year that Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in Germany, so keep that in your minds. The British Army at that time were pretty well behind the German army in terms of equipment, doctrine, weapons, and many things. But George joins as a very young man. There's an empire aspect to the soldiering, which he was keen to do. He was keen to serve abroad. But up in Catterick, his first posting, he spends quite a bit of time fox hunting, as young officers did in those days, and a lot of time on the North Yorkshire moors in exercise, which he really didn't enjoy. But really, the first shafts of sight that George is going to become a proper leader is when he's sent on a signalling course about a year after he's commissioned, where an NCO writes, and his mother had the report in the family album, says, "This young officer has marked leadership potential." And that's really the first sign that we see that George is going to be going places in the army. I talked about the Empire. In 1936, his battalion, the 1st Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers, are sent out to Shanghai. At that time, not many people know this, but at that time, Britain had concessionary interests in both Shanghai and in Tientsin, which were a hangover from the Opium Wars, actually, of the 1840s, where we had, along with some other countries, US, Italy, France, we had some areas within those ports that we could trade, and the British Army obviously was sent out there to defend those interests. And so George is out there in 1936. Don't forget that Japan have invaded Manchuria in 1933, and the war is brewing between Japan and China in the Far East, to the extent that the Lancashire Fusiliers get involved as the Japanese start invading further south in China. The Lancashire Fusiliers get involved in effectively a Mexican standoff between the Japanese and the Chinese. And I always think about that, and the British Army has always been very, very good at internal security work. That is almost a bit like Northern Ireland, where the army is in the middle there between the Chinese trying to get into the English cantonment because they want protection from the Japanese, and the Japanese coming, and the Lancashire Fusiliers having to play the middle line. So very tricky posting. But actually, by 1939, the battalion had been moved to Quetta, which is in northwest, well, at that time was in northwest India, now in Pakistan. And George is now a captain, and he's beginning to get a bit bored. 1939, the war's kicked off in Europe, and George and his men are all stuck in India, and there's really not a lot happening. His brother, I'll come back to Christopher, his younger brother, in a minute, has already joined the Lancashire Fusiliers and is serving in France and Belgium, and at the start of the Pony War. And George is getting increasingly frustrated until an opportunity presents itself where a parachute battalion, or in fact a parachute brigade, it's decided in line with the development of the British Airborne Forces in the UK, it's decided to form a parachute battalion, a brigade rather, in India. And George volunteers immediately to join that. He wants to see some action. And he becomes the first adjutant of a newly formed battalion, the 151 Parachute Battalion, which is formed in Delhi. The commanding officer of which is a gentleman called Martin Lindsay, who before the war had been a polar explorer. And he became a baronet. He was a baronet after the war and an MP. But he was a most unusual and quite controversial officer, not one who really sat very well with headquarters in Indian Army headquarters in Delhi, but he had an amazing gift of leadership, of being able to enthuse and encourage people around him. And between him and George, they go around the 26 infantry battalions in India recruiting for this new parachute battalion. And parachuting in those days was incredibly rudimentary. So they don't have enough parachutes for all the people they're recruiting. They have incredibly aged First World War aircraft, Vickers Valencias, which they had to drop out through a hole in the fuselage, and they get some fatalities because of the nature of what they're doing is so rudimentary. George, as one of the officers involved in setting up the battalion, about a year after it's established, they've suffered quite a few fatalities of parachutes that hadn't opened. In particular, George told his son in later life that one of their problems they had was the parachutes were made of a certain silk fabric, and to the extent that when they jumped, they had to flap their arms in order to generate some air to fill up the canopy. George himself has a near miss. He lands on the steps of the racecourse in Delhi, and he's in hospital for nearly a month because he's badly broken up. But after he comes out, the officers decide that they need to restore confidence in the parachute team. So you can see that picture on the screen now. That's a confidence jump. There you've got the officers of 151 Parachute Battalion. George is circled there. John Waddy, who was a very well-known parachute airborne and forces soldier, both Arnhem and beyond, is third from the right there. And they can see they're jumping without helmets. And they're jumping without reserve chutes. In fact, the British, I believe I'm right in saying the British Airborne didn't jump with the reserve chutes for the whole of the war, unlike the Americans. And in fact, I think it was Major Tony Hibbert who said that when the Americans arrived in the UK in 1943 with all their reserve chutes, they were rather thought of by the British Airborne to be sissies for the fact that they had reserve chutes, even though it strikes me it was pretty sensible. But there you have it, a confidence jump, officers jumping without helmets and without reserves to restore confidence in the fledgling battalion.
Just a quick question for you, Rupert. When he was overseas, we've talked on his channel about the home battalions and the overseas battalions. Had George been keeping up to date with what was happening in terms of doctrine and things like that back in the UK? Because that's where the training manuals are being written and things like that. Is he, because as a junior officer, you can kind of apply for the updates. They don't necessarily get issued to you. Is he keeping his finger on things and reading about the Blitzkrieg and things like that? I mean, obviously he's got balls to jump out of an aircraft in the way you've mentioned. He's got determination, will, and a wish to deal with the enemy. But is he keeping up to date with the technological advances?
Well, he is, but rather an indirect route, because brother Christopher is in the Home Service Battalion, the 2nd Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers, and is France, and is sending letters back to his parents addressed to George, which then get sent through to George. So he's hearing what's going on in France and Belgium during the Phoney War. The other thing to remember from a parachute or airborne perspective is there was a small team that was sent out to India from Ringway. From the genesis of the British Airborne capability at Ringway, a small team was sent out to help the parachute battalions in India learn the mistakes and learn the riggings. So yeah, he's picking it up really via two means. There were disciplinary problems though, because there was no one to fight. I'm sure your listeners will know, when you've got a bunch of alpha males who are joining up, as these men were, from all their various battalions for action, because they're seeing their colleagues fighting in Europe, there's no one to fight in India, and that causes problems to the extent that there's a cocktail event at the Viceroy's Palace one evening, and some of the men from the battalion are involved in some problems there. And Wavell then decides, although he was very, very sympathetic to the parachute battalions, he was a strong supporter, he decides to move the battalion to the Middle East, really to give them a bit more focus and purpose. So they are moved in late 1942. They're moved to Kabrit, where the SAS, interestingly, had their headquarters and were starting to do their long-range patrols. And the battalions start working up there, a lot of training in Palestine, and then ultimately, and I'm skipping a bit here, they get involved in Operation Slapstick, which unfortunately is not an airborne operation. They've seen their colleagues from the 1st Parachute Brigade drop in North Africa. They are taken by ship to Taranto in late 1943, and they start fighting their way up the heel of Italy, really to support the main landings which had happened at Salerno at roughly the same time. George at that point is now a company commander, and in fact he becomes 2IC of it's been renumbered 156 Parachute Battalion, mainly to confuse the Germans, and he's involved in some fighting against the German Fallschirmjäger in the heel of Italy. But the battalion is only really there for a few weeks. One interesting fact for your listeners, the only British airborne general to be killed during the war was killed in an action involved in involved in this battalion when he was shot through the head when he was looking over a wall to monitor progress of the battalion that was attacking an enemy position. That was General Hopkinson. But quite soon after that, the battalion is withdrawn back to the UK. And George, just before that happens, George has been handpicked by Brigadier Shan Hackett, who became a big mentor and a big supporter and a big sponsor of George. George is picked to be the brigade major of the 4th Parachute Brigade, of which the 156 Parachute Battalion forms part. And it's taken back to the UK. And so George is now part of the 4th Parachute Brigade headquarters in early 1944, back in the UK, being hopefully, I think this was the hopes and anticipations of a lot of the men, hoping that they would be in a position to be used for the second front. Here's a photo of George as brigade major of the 4th Parachute Brigade, involved in what I believe was Operation Mush, which was the only time I believe that the 1st British Airborne Division actually exercised as a whole division before Arnhem. And what they did, they dropped into a part of Gloucestershire where the 6th Airborne Division were used as the defensive troops. And of course, I think it's probably pretty natural. A lot of the soldiers of the 1st Airborne Division thought, this is it. We're being used. We're testing and being used to test the air movement and the airdrops, because we're going to be the guys that go in on the second front. But unfortunately, it had already been decided, I believe, by that time, that actually the 6th Airborne were going to be the division used in Normandy. And the reason they weren't dropping is that they wanted to preserve as many people as possible for that operation. So big disappointment in Operation Mush. But George gets a lot of credit for how the brigade, the 4th Parachute Brigade, aspect of that exercise goes. Certainly wins Hackett's confidence. And Hackett was a tough taskmaster, acerbic, very strong intellect, and didn't suffer fools gladly. And George was the perfect foil to the Hackett rapier. Tall, as you can see in the picture, he was 6'4", tall, languid, patrician, avuncular, and charming, but steely. And that was a lovely foil to Hackett's slightly more acerbic way of dealing with things. As the division starts preparing for combat, there is a problem in one of the battalions within the 4th Parachute Brigade, the 11th Parachute Battalion, where Colonel Mickey Thomas, in Hackett's eyes, had lost grip of the battalion. There were disciplinary problems, which culminated in a mass walkout one Friday during pay parade, and Mickey Thomas is immediately removed by Hackett. There were other things as well that led up to that, problems with drill, problems on exercises, but that was the last straw for Hackett, and he removes Mickey Thomas, who gets sent back to his old regiment, and George is put in as CO in July 1944. He becomes CO of the battalion, and literally has a very short period of time to work it up into a proper fighting state.
Because this is the era when airborne forces, or special forces we might call it, is being really professionalized by 1944. This is 18 months on from the private army aspect of 2 years earlier, where it was sort of renegade captains and majors starting their own units by just sort of doing it. This is now becoming, the airborne forces are becoming a key part of the structure of the British Army. So you've got to have that kind of ballsiness of jumping out of aircraft, but you've got to know how to play the game. And it's clear that Shan Hackett recognizes in George this ability to be professional within something that is still new and exciting and bold.
Yeah, I think the 11th Parachute Battalion had its particular problems. They've been assembled in the Middle East from a composite, from lots of different types of units, and it really needed grip, as Hackett described it, and George was the man to do that. As everyone knows, there was 16 cancelled operations in the lead up to Arnhem, and that involved a lot of frustration across the whole division, actually. But there's an orders group about 2 or 3 days before Arnhem that Hackett leads. He's got his commanding officers from the 3 battalions, including George, in the room, and all his brigade officers and senior NCOs, and he clears the room after the main brief and says to his 3 commanding officers and a couple of select other officers, you can forget everything that you've just heard. Our big problem is going to be not getting to the north part of the outskirts of the town, which was the brigade's objective, to hold that. The problem will be getting into Arnhem itself, and how right he was. That was the measure of the man, actually. Hackett was an incredibly clever man, and he could see the flaws in the plan. So moving into Arnhem itself, and obviously it's a pretty well-trailed subject, this, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the operation itself. I suspect a lot of your listeners already know a lot. What I wanted to do was just focus on George's role and George's involvement in it. So he flies out on Monday the 18th as the lead aircraft of his battalion. And he's number one in the stick. He's got his Batman with him. He's got the intelligence officer, medical officer, and the defence, the headquarters defence platoon in his aircraft. And they jump about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But of course, the Germans are waiting for them. This is the second day. The Germans, it was pretty. One of the things that actually I always think is not really covered terribly well about Arnhem is quite how quick the Germans marshalled themselves and worked out very quickly what the plan was. It was pretty obvious, wasn't it? The jump zones were 8 miles from the bridge, and it was pretty clear that the paratroopers are there to hold the bridge. So George jumps with his 570 men, and quite a few of them are killed in the air because the Germans are waiting. I always think about that iconic picture of Germans on the edge of the wood of drop zone Y, I think it was, with the MG-42 just firing up into the sky. And so guys were killed before they even hit the ground. George makes it down. They're jumping from 500 feet, about 20 seconds, 30 seconds in the air, and he hits the ground with a hell of a thud, and he dislocates his shoulder, which, given you're landing into a burning heath, because the Germans have been dropping mortar rounds onto it, you've got a dislocated shoulder, and you're pretty disorientated anyway, and you're trying to look for where your battalion RV was, which was down in the southwest corner of the drop zone. So George is running across the drop zone, trying to collect up soldiers as he goes. And when he arrives at the RV, he's met by Colonel Charles Mackenzie, the Chief of Staff of the division, who's got some pretty somber news for him. First of all, the general's gone missing. So Urquhart had gone forward to encourage and see what the 1st Parachute Brigade were trying to do the previous afternoon to get into Arnhem. And he's been trapped, and no one knows where he is. And in his absence, Brigadier Pip Hicks has taken control of the division. And George's orders have been changed. He's not to provide cover for 156 Parachute, his old battalion, going into the northwest outskirts. Instead, he's to go straight into the town and join the remnants of the 1st Parachute Brigade, who are trying to fight their way through to Colonel John Frost and the band of men he's managed to get through to the north end of the bridge. So George doesn't question the orders at all, even though they've not come from his immediate chain command, and marches into the town. And this is where lots of people have written as to why Arnhem failed. But when I was researching for the book, I was really intrigued by this. There's quite a long wait at the RV because George is trying to get signal comms with the division at Hartenstein Hotel. He can't get through. After about 2 hours of trying and getting the units all assembled, he just makes the decision to go into the town. They meet all their artillery on the way and all their jeeps and ammo jeeps, and they get to the hotel. And George goes inside to get his more detailed orders from Brigadier Pip Hicks, and they're waiting there for 3 hours. So one of the company commanders, Andrew Gilchrist, wrote after the war, when they were all asked, and George was one of them, asked to give a lessons learned about Arnhem in the early 1950s. Andrew Gilchrist actually said that he thought that delay had that 3 hour delay where the 11th Parachute Battalion was sitting, kicking their heels around outside the Hartenstein Hotel. That was one of the reasons why they lost the battle in the town. I don't know. I think there were a lot of other reasons as well. So George gets his orders and is directed into the town, where they march overnight. Long snake, about a mile long, 600 odd men, and George gets into the town to get into an orders group that Colonel Doby of the 1st Parachute Battalion and Colonel McCarty of the 2nd Staffordshire Battalion are having, and they're trying to work out the best way to try and get their battalions into through the German screen that had been laid between them and the north end of the bridge. And they hatch a plan, the three lieutenant colonels. And to cut a very long story short, the plan unravels pretty quickly early the following morning. And George's part of it's quite interesting because, again, writing the lessons learned after the war. And this is a feature of him. He was very humble in many ways. He admits to making quite a big mistake. Originally, his battalion was to follow the 1st Parachute Battalion under Colonel Dobie down the Onderlangs, which was the lower river route, into the town. That was the original plan. But George sees what happens as the 1st Battalion go down, 1st Parachute Battalion go there, and the fire, and changes his mind and decides and agrees with McCarty that actually his battalion is going to follow the 2nd South Staffordshires along the top road. But he doesn't tell Dobie that that's what he's doing. And after the war, he wrote, actually, that was really wrong on me. I should have called David Dobie. I should have got in contact or sent a runner or something to tell him. But again, that was not a mistake that I think really had much bearing.
Yeah, and a bigger mistake is that Urquhart is now cut off, so there's no top dog at this point. So
exactly, and you got 3 lieutenant colonels, all of equivalent rank, trying to put a plan together. None of them's the most senior, so it was the fog. I describe it as the fog of war, and certainly that was the case in Arnhem town. So Lee's battalion sees what happens to the 2nd South Staffords as they get repelled back by the German defences around the museum and the town. And he starts then getting conflicting orders from the division. Urquhart, by this stage, who wasn't very far away from them, actually, he was just a couple of streets away, gets released as the South Staffords go through the area that he's in. He gets released and he gets back to divisional headquarters and realizes there's a big problem in the town. He sends one of I think it's the deputy of the 1st Air Landing Brigade is sent into town, Colonel Barlow, but he never, to take control and be the most senior officer, he never gets there. He gets killed on the way. And George is getting counter order after counter order. One of his officers, again, I think it was Gilchrist, said, we'd have one orders group. And Colonel Lee would dish out the orders. And just as we were finishing, the intelligence officer would come in and say, actually, there's a new set of orders. And so during the course of that morning, he's getting different orders, which ultimately end up with him getting orders to take the high ground north of the railway. And just to cut the story a little bit shorter, given the time, as he's forming up to do that, to take the high ground, with a mixture. He's got some South Staffords under command. He's got some members of the 1st Parachute Battalion on command as well. They get caught in the open by some German lorried infantry and Stug 80s that come from the west of the town, and they come through the sunken part of the railway line and then cut south and then cut west. And just as George is forming up his battalion, ready to take the high ground, they get pounced on. And George said later in the wash up, we were caught on the hop, no doubt about it. And of course, the battalion takes a lot of casualties, and the command structure disintegrates as people just scramble for the nearest houses, and you get platoons get mixed up, companies get mixed up, men get mixed up with no officers or just officers together. It's a mess, or as General Hackett would describe it, a grossly untidy situation. George tries to bring order. It's impossible. People are scattered around the various streets in Arnhem. He then tries to go forward because one of his companies is still, A company is still with the South Staffordshires. He goes forward to try and bring them back, and he gets caught and surrounded in a house. They decide not to fight their way out, and he's with Major Dan Webber, who's the OC of Headquarters Company, and a few of his soldiers. And the biggest ignominy really of all, he gets captured as a lieutenant colonel. And even though they were all told to take off their badges of rank as quickly as they could after they were captured, the Germans were smart, and they realized pretty quickly who the officers are, and they go segregate the officers out, and the officers get taken off for debriefing or interrogation. And George ultimately ends up, after some time at the Durlang at Hadamar, where the Germans try to play all kinds of tricks with them with the Red Cross cards, saying you can only send a Red Cross card if you give us more than your name, number, and rank, which George won't do. He ends up in Offlag 79 in Brunswick, and he spends the rest of the war there. And not a great experience. You know, the winter of 1944-45 is really cold, and the Red Cross parcels are not coming through because the German railway network is being smashed by day by the US Air Force and at night by the Royal Air Force. So Germany is beginning to crumble. And actually, those who were imprisoned in Oflag and the late stages of the war, all the Arnhem folk, yeah, they kind of knew the war was only a matter of time. So there really wasn't much point in thinking about escaping. And George effectively sits out his last 8 months of the war there. Repatriated, he gets sent out to the Far East to join the airborne division that had been created out there. The plan was to drop people into Singapore. As the Japanese army were being recoiled through Burma, the plan was to drop airborne people into Malaya and to Singapore. That gets overtaken by events as the 2 atomic bombs bring the Second World War. And George is brought back. He's made the CO of a TA battalion in Yorkshire, which wasn't really his bag. Here you can see a photo of him. They're doing a demonstration jump in Leeds. He's number 2 in the stick there, you can see. This is in front of about 5,000 people. They do a demonstration jump. You can imagine 5,000 people turning out to watch the Parachute Regiment jump today. I'm not sure it would happen. But anyway, and one of the interesting things about his time as CO of this TA battalion in Yorkshire is that he's given a group of SAS reserves led by a chap called Johnny Cooper, who's rejoined the SAS reserves.
The Johnny Cooper, yeah.
The Johnny Cooper, one of the originals. And I'll come back to him in a minute because he plays a part in the Malaya story. And from Yorkshire, George then goes on a couple of courses, staff courses, and then he ends up in Shape, where Monty is deputy secretary. This is the mid-1954. Monty upsetting everyone in Europe and pretty well everyone in his headquarters. And George is a lieutenant colonel working in the logistics team in Shape. And Shape's very much, this is very early days of NATO, and everyone's trying to work out how to work with each other. And frankly, Monty was a bit of a problem because he couldn't really work with the Europeans.
Just a quick question about Arnhem. Yeah. I mean, I know we're going to get onto it, but the legacy of that is, I mean, years and years ago, I attended a lecture by Colonel John Frost, and it was clear that he was bitter about Arnhem and probably refought that battle in his head every single day for the rest of his life. Was George the kind of guy when he was in the off-flag to kind of sit there and think high road, low road, if I'd sent, the A company this way, B, or was he thinking forwards about what his next career would be?
No, very much the former. So very self-effacing, very much took the destruction of his battalion within 36 hours of landing very personally, felt very responsible. 97 men killed in Arnhem, only about 100 got out the other side across the Rhine, and about 400 of them captured, including him. How embarrassing, And he really felt that Arnhem really rankled with him for the rest of his life, actually, to the extent that it was a very brave ADC when he was a general who asked about Arnhem. He got pretty short shrift, and certainly his kids told me he never discussed Arnhem. Right. He never went to any of the reunions. So he just cut it out of his mind.
Thank you.
So where did we get to? Shape and Monty. So in 1955, George is being slated to command the 2nd Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers, which are in Trieste. But before he can actually take command, the army makes the decision to put into suspended animation all the 2nd battalions of all the county regiments. So George hasn't got a job. At which point, Mrs. Lee, Pamela, who he'd met in Quetta in the Amateur Dramatic Society. By the way, George was not an actor at all. He just rather liked Pamela. So he managed to get himself a leading role opposite her in a play. But Pamela was of quite stout disposition, and she said to him, right, it's time for you to come out of the army. And George was literally about to hand his papers in when he gets a call from the military secretary's office saying, Colonel Lee, how do you fancy a bit of parachuting? To which his answer is, well, I haven't parachuted for nearly 8 years. And I've been living in Paris for the last 3 with French cuisine. I'm probably not in proper shape to actually be a parachutist again. They said, well, we've got a fantastic job for you, but we can't tell you where it is. But it's in the Far East and it involves parachuting. And of course, it transpires that he's been selected to command 22 SAS, which was very much in its early fledgling days, still in 1954, late 1954, but is based in Malaya and is fighting the communist terrorist threat. And George joins 22 SAS very much at an inflection point. There are people on the Army Council who want to basically disband it after the Malayan Emergency. There have been a lot of disciplinary problems. So to give you just a short synopsis of the genesis of the SAS after the war, it was all disbanded at the end of the war. But in 1950, a squadron from 21 SAS Regiment, the Artist Rifle, is slated to go to Korea. But the Americans decide they'll do all the special forces work themselves. So they get sent to Malaya, and under the command of Colonel Brigadier Mike Culver, as he became, who was a Chindit, I'll come back to that in a minute, he sets up effectively the Malayan Scouts and builds what becomes what George inherits at the end of the beginning of 1955, 22 SAS. But there are disciplinary problems. There are as many problems out of the jungle as they are in the jungle, and they're not actually achieving the same hit rate with the communist terrorists as the infantry battalions, the regular infantry battalions out there. So George is very much given a mandate of make it or break it. So he arrives, and he's quite shocked to learn that discipline is a big problem. So in fact, an NCO had struck an officer about a week before he arrived, and it had all been settled on a handshake, which George was not happy about. But it gave him a flavour for how the regiment was operating. On his first morning, he's written about this at length, but his first morning, he eases himself into the CO's chair, and his RSM, who was a real martinet called Neville Sid Reed, marches in, very thin man, nicknamed as Chesty because he was so thin. And he salutes him and says, "Right, Colonel Lee, I'd like to know what your policy is." And George later wrote, "I must have been a huge disappointment to this man because I had absolutely no policy at all." So he was having to wing this completely. But what he started doing, he started weeding out people, particularly officers, who he didn't think were suited to special forces work. And he started weeding out soldiers as well, encouraging the officers to, and started bringing in people like Johnny Cooper, who was brought in as a squadron commander, B Squadron, under Lee. He also had, and this is always a sign of a good leader, he started building a really good team around him. So he had Cooper, who of course had the World War II long-range penetration experience. And he also had John Woodhouse, who I think, out of all the officers you read about in the SAS, John Woodhouse was Mr. SAS. He also had John Slim, Field Marshal Slim's son, who was a very capable officer, later became a CO, and he built a really good team around him. Weeded out the officers that weren't suitable, brought on young officers like Peter de la Billiere, who joined the SAS when George was CO. And he starts changing the tactics as well. So hitherto, the patrols have been going out for 3 months at a time, long-range patrols, but very noisy, and not really achieving very much, and certainly not really following through the hearts and minds doctrine that has already been laid out by Harold Briggs. So Harold Briggs, which was very much around dislocating the terrorists from the villagers who were their source of food and supply. And so George changes the SAS tactics. He stops them from the long-range patrolling and starts putting them into forts, starts putting troops or squadrons into forts around Malaya and giving them areas of responsibility where hearts and minds was everything. So for the villagers, making sure the SAS were providing them with medical facilities, allowing them to pray when they wanted to pray without interference from the small things like that, which culturally won the people's trust. Also, a lot of the villagers were also moved into separate villages away from the terrorists. So a change in tactics. He also gets Woodhouse to write an operations manual about patrolling in the jungle. That's never been done before. The SAS had never had a manual. And really starts to impose himself. But probably most importantly, here's a photo of him shaking hands with Sir Anthony Eden shortly after he takes command with his swagger stick under his left arm. But probably most importantly, and this is what he got the Distinguished Service Order for, his command, he's out in the field. He's tree jumping. He was told when he first arrived he wasn't allowed to tree jump at all, parachute at all. The tree jumping, for those that don't know, was a very quick method of insertion into the jungle where the guys would jump out of aircraft, hit the tree canopy, and as you can imagine, there were fatalities and serious accidents, and drop a rope down 100 foot and then get their harness off and drop themselves down a rope. George was told when he arrived, you're afraid, sir, you're not going to be tree jumping, because the last CO, Oliver Brooke, broke his leg so badly tree jumping, we can't risk that again. But of course, within a year, George is tree jumping with everyone else. And as you can see in the photo, he was not a desk-bound CO. He's out suffering the same privations as his guys, going on patrol, going hard routine, and he won over the respect of the men pretty quickly by that.
I knew an SAS veteran of this era years and years ago who walked on 2 sticks. And when I say walked, I mean he struggled, and he had a particular sort of disparaging way of saying fucking tree jumping. That was sort of proud of what he'd done, but very fucking tree jumping. And we learned not to ask him about it.
Yeah, so George was very instrumental as a part of encouraging the use of helicopters. So they might tree jump a few guys into the jungle and then get them to clear an area so that helicopters would bring the majority of people in. Yeah, and here you can see, this is George winning the respect of the NCOs. He's in the mess there. You can see him in the middle. He's got Sid, the Martinet Chesty, next to him, who never left his side. They formed a great team, similar to the Hackett-Lee axis, the Lee-Reed axis. Reed with real Martinet, George firm, but probably fairer. And he's talking to the NCOs in the mess, winning them over. I want to just, before I move on from the SS, I want to talk quickly about the New Zealand Squadron, which was formed in 1955 as the New Zealand contribution to the Malayan problem. And they sent up a squadron of about 180 men. And George, at this stage, he's got the New Zealand Squadron, he's got 3 SAS regular squadrons, and he's also got a parachute squadron sent out as well under Dudley Coventry. But the Kiwis in particular really, really resonate with George, and they build a huge respect for him because of just the way he conducted himself as a leader. And here you can see Trooper's son, that's the Maori trooper on the left, handing over what's called a mire to George as he's leaving command of 22 SAS. For those of you who follow rugby, the mire is the thing that when they do the haka, the guy that holds out that kind of nasty looking knife, that's a mire. And the Maoris will only give that to people who they consider to be chieftains. And George was their father. He brought them up. He taught them, along with Woodhouse, he taught them how to fight in the jungle. And they had huge respect for him, to the extent that they kept inviting him back to New Zealand for anniversaries and celebrations. And I think very much to his regret, he was unable to go to those. But here he is being handed his mire. So hugely successful tour. He's succeeded as CO by a chap called Anthony Dean Drummond, who for the Arnhem anoraks, as Neil Cherry would describe them, was nicknamed Cupboard because he'd hidden in a cupboard for 13 days of the Arnhem operation.
Had a bit of a better, happier ending at Arnhem than George.
He did. He did. I think I'm right in saying he was one of the Pegasus. Did he get out of one of the Pegasus patrols out? But yeah, he was. He came in after George, and actually, one of the things that George did do was sold the SAS. Apart from all the tactical stuff that was going on in the jungle, he was also playing a macro strategic game with the Army Council of demonstrating that the SAS had a future as a strategic asset beyond Malaya, and he's very successful at that. And Dean Drummond was able to take 2 squadrons out to Oman, where you had the Jekyll Abdel mountain thing, where they scaled a mountain that no one thought anyone could climb. Peter Le Villiers winning a military cross during that course. So hugely successful. George is immediately promoted to a brigadier, which is quite unusual to get a lieutenant colonel or brigadier. But I think the army could really see his true worth now, and he's put him in charge of a brigade in the UK as part of the Strategic Reserve. Frankly, I think George was a bit bored doing that. But he managed to keep his links with Hereford. So whenever battalions in his brigade were on exercise on Dartmoor, he would always get the SAS to act as enemy. And that was his way of staying in touch with Hereford and finding out what they were up to. But then, and he's made a major general pretty shortly after that. He does a stint in the military secretary's office, which is just a really good posting to understand how the army promotion system works. And then as a major general, he's given command of a territorial division in Preston for the northwest area. And again, probably not really a job. I think a lot of people looked at that and thought, well, that's the end of George Lee's career as a major general, given command of a territorial division. But he was hugely effective in winning around the civic authorities. And there's some lovely stories in my book about him going mayor baiting, as he called it, which was building relations with the municipal authorities. A lovely story in there about one particular occasion. I'll let people read that in the book. But from that, one morning he's having breakfast in Preston and he gets a letter from the military secretary saying, "Stand by for a fast one, George." And this one really was a fast one. He was being sent to Zambia, to northern Rhodesia, to manage the military aspects of the breakup of the Central African Federation, which was really a very unequal alliance between one self-governing territory, southern Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe under Ian Smith, and then two British protectorates north of that, northern Rhodesia, which became Zambia, and Nyasaland, which became Malawi. And George is given the really tricky task, I think, of making sure that there isn't bloodshed as the Central African Federation is disentangled and each of those states transition into nationhood. Because, of course, we've had the Harold Macmillan Winds of Change speech already, saying that, it's important that Britain divests itself of all these different interests it's got, particularly in Africa. And George does a cracking job there. There were problems. There was civil unrest in northern Rhodesia, particularly up on the border by Congo, where there's copper mining and a big copper belt there. That, of course, that prospect. And the southern Rhodesians are difficult. They've got a white supremacy model. Ian Smith is talking, despite the fact they're massively outnumbered by black Africans, they're talking about only whites in government. And George has got a really tricky job of managing all of that. And he does it really, really successfully. And in particular, this is the point I want to bring out in the soldiers general part of this. He spends a lot of time talking to the Ashkaris, the African soldiers, who are going to form parts of these different, well, certainly the two northern states' armies. And don't forget, a lot of these guys had fought in the Second World War, particularly in Burma. And in North Africa as well. And they were beginning to resent the British officers. They wanted African officers. They wanted to be led by their own people. George was very, very good at talking them through and just allaying concerns around that. And ultimately, actually, a lot of the British officers left Africa after the Confederation was brought to him. He's so successful that there's an even more demanding job being laid on for him, Director of Operations in Borneo. So this is in 1965. The Borneo confrontation had started really with a revolt in Brunei in 1963. And really this is about President Suharto of Indonesia wanting to stop the Federation of Malaysia, which include the island of Borneo and the British northern parts of that island, Sarawak and Sabah. And you've got Brunei as well, the very oil-rich state of Little Brunei right in the middle there. And George is sent out as Director of Operations. And in many ways, and I talked earlier about the boxing ring and George being able to finish things. He finished the Central African Federation tricky, but Borneo, I think, along with the SAS command, Borneo really was the height of his career. Really, really politically delicate campaign. And the reason it was politically delicate is before George had arrived, Walter Walker, who'd been his predecessor, had agreed with Dennis Healy as Secretary of State for Defence that that they would try and head off the Indonesians, stop them coming over the border from Kalimantan into northern Borneo by sending British troops into Kalimantan, which was Indonesian sovereign territory. But the British government did not want that to be public information, for a number of reasons. One, it just didn't look good for people opening their newspapers at breakfast to read that British soldiers were going into Indonesia, killing Indonesians and potentially being killed. But probably more importantly, they were worried about the loss of face from Suharto. Yeah, if it became public that Indonesians have been killed in Indonesia, there was a worry that Suharto would escalate it into a proper war. So it's just a conflict.
And at this point, Rupert, I'm just thinking about the number of different hats he's juggling at this point, and he's got to have the respect of the soldiers and people like that of these various countries he's meeting. He's being posted to. He's got to have awareness of the geopolitical situation, the cultural situation, understanding of the different languages, understanding of being able to communicate effectively to all these different people, to be charismatic enough for people to listen to you, to be patient to listen to other people. I mean, if you're recruiting for this position right now, you could spend a lot of time going through hundreds of candidates before you find someone that's got all the skill sets he's got from the way you're explaining it. I mean, extraordinary range of talent.
And there was a tri-service command as well. So they had Royal Navy minesweepers under. So that required real delicacy. He had special branch. He had all the police people. So one of the first things he did was set up a tri-service, multi-agency command structure where the police special branch were there because they had problems with communist Indonesians in Borneo itself. So they had an internal threat as well as an external threat. And he really brought that together well. He had the RAF talking to the Royal Navy, the Royal Navy talking to the Army for once, and special branch and the civilian authorities as well, and the police generally, all talking to each other. He was also, if George was sitting here right now, he would say he was lucky he had two very gifted officers on his staff. Anthony Farrar-Hockley was his chief of staff, incredibly capable. But again, rather like the Hackett-Lee axis, the Lee-Farrar-Hockley axis was quite interesting because Farrar-Hockley had an ability to be able to upset people, and Lee was very much the urbane, patrician, avuncular, charming, smooth it all over. Farrar-Hockley was then succeeded by an equally capable officer, Nigel Bagnall, who became a field marshal. So he was, George would say he was lucky, but he just had the ability to be able to navigate through this kind of political minefield. And he used the Claret operations as it's a really interesting study of warfare, that because towards the end of 1965, there's a big coup in Indonesia by the communists, which is put down by the army, the Indonesian army. And Sukarno is replaced. Sorry, I got that wrong earlier. Sukarno is actually replaced by General Suharto, who is anti-confrontation and realizes they can't win militarily. So they start trying to negotiate with the Malaysians. And every time the Indonesians start getting difficult at the negotiating table, George orders another Claret operation, and some Gurkhas or the SAS go over the border and start causing questions as to in the enemy's mind as to what's going on behind us. And those Claret operations were so secret that in fact there was a Gurkha who won a VC in the Borneo confrontation conflict, and actually his citation was slightly altered to make it look as though he won it in Borneo. He actually won it in Indonesia, just over the border. And that's how sensitive it was. Casualties had to be carried back, even dead bodies. Spent cartridges collected up. And they had explicit, so there were golden rules on engagement. They were not to get into firefights. They were just a skirmish, shoot and scoot. And George was managing all of that, so it must have been huge pressure, to be honest. But he was up. Sorry, I'm going to go through some. He was up to it. And here I mentioned the Tri-Nation. Here he is talking to some sailors on HMS Kildarton, which was a ton-class minesweeper. And you can just see, can't you, from, I think the picture tells the story, really, how relaxed the sailors are chatting to him. Yeah. I think they got the ship's dog or the ship's cat there. I can't really see it. But, they look pretty relaxed. And so does George. He's just winning confidence of people around him. He flew everywhere. He was, again, like Malaya, he was not a man sitting behind a desk. He pretty well went everywhere, including right onto the border, with the SAS, who reported directly into him, and they loved it, of course, because he understood what they were about. But there was never, there was always another aspect of George's character I probably haven't brought out very much, is he had a great sense of humour as well. And there was always a bit of fun around when George was off duty. Here he is dancing in a longhouse. There's some lovely stories in my book, particularly about a visit by Dennis Healy out to Borneo. Healy asked to be taken down to a longhouse because he wanted to meet a Dayak Heb tribesman who was concerned about the British pulling out of Borneo after negotiations. So they organised that, and Dennis Healy goes down to this longhouse. They go down the Limbang River. They get there under heavy armed guard. And Healy goes in and he sits down cross-legged on the floor. Healy was a diplomat as well as a soldier. He'd served in the Second World War. So he understood the need for diplomacy. And through the interpreter, they're exchanging pleasantries, and the Dayak head tribesman's explaining how concerned he is after the Brits pull out of Borneo, what's going to happen. And Healy's giving him reassurances. And at the end of that, they stand up to leave, and the Dayak tribesman hands Healy a bag, which looks as though it's got a football in it. And Healy, being a diplomat, of course, takes it because he recognizes that that's obviously a gesture of goodwill or respect, takes it, and they turn around and start walking out of the longhouse, and they starting walking to the helicopter that's going to take them back to the capital of Sarawak, Kuching, where the world's press are waiting to interview Dennis Healy. And George, of course, has the presence of mind to take the bag off the Secretary of State for Defence because, of course, it's got a severed head in it. And so that's classic George, just reading a situation well, realizing actually it probably wouldn't look too good if Secretary of State Defence arrived in front of the world's press with a severed head in the bag. But there's loads of other stories about the Healy visit, funny ones about animals and the like. George loved animals. There were always animals. There was a honey bear that lived in the garden, but that's probably for another time. Here's George in all his finery. He got on particularly well with the Sultan of Brunei. There's an important relationship and it still is between the UK and Brunei. Here's George, and that collarette he's got around him. And I'm sorry, forgive me, I've forgotten what it's called, but it's a very special award that's only given by the Sultan to respected people. I don't think any other British Army officers ever awarded it. But George gets that, and of course immediately makes a quip about it that he reckons he's got more bling than the Mayor of Kidderminster. So he found that all very highly amusing. And then finally moving on to his last job in the army, which, really, I think, if you look at his career, why didn't he go to the top of the army? Some of the answers possibly are in this. George is sent out to the US in 1967 after wrapping up Borneo. And you need to understand the context here. 1967, America's getting dragged into the Vietnam War. President Lyndon Johnson wants the British government to put boots on the ground in Vietnam. Harold Wilson, the PM at the time, quite rightly refuses to do that. We couldn't afford it apart from anything else. There was a big financial crisis in the late 1960s. So George is sent as a first stream officer. So the Americans only wanted someone who was first stream. So that's an officer who's going on to the top of the army. He's sent out there, I believe, as a SOP for the Americans. And so he's given a mandate by the Chief of the Defense Staff to go around all the various American military academies, talking to them about Malaya, Borneo, what worked, having a hearts and minds strategy, winning over the local people, dislocating them from the terrorists, and having a political solution alongside your military solution, which of course, if you look at Vietnam at that time, the Americans didn't have a political solution. They only really were trying to crack it militarily. So George does a lot of work. He has some really tricky things to deal with whilst he's there. You had a British Army officer who decided to join the US Army and go and fight in Vietnam. There was a huge amount of publicity given the unpopularity about the Vietnam War in the States at that time. George has to manage his way through all of that. And then you get the My Lai massacre, where George is in a really, really unique and really actually earns his salary because he gets on extremely well with the chief of the American staff, general staff, called William Dupuy. The American Army, after the My Lai massacre occurred, I think it was in April 1968, the American Army tried to cover it up. And of course, it became knowledgeable that an American Army unit had gone into a village and effectively killed all the civilians. Dupuy confides in Lee very early doors about what's happened, which enables George to send that message back to the Chief of the Defence Staff, a chap called Lord Ellsworthy, Marshal of the Air Force, Lord Ellsworthy, who is ready to be able to deal with the press the minute it blows in the press. So George really earning his salary there. But he didn't become, and he didn't go on. Here he is in the social glitzy, which he was really good at. Yeah, there was small talk at dinner parties here. You can just see he's chatting to Natasha, his wife there. George was brilliant at that kind of stuff. You know, the small talk, the avuncular patrician, tall Englishman, paratrooper, special forces. You know, he just went down so well in Washington. But he didn't become Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, which I'm told he was promised when he was in Washington. And why is that? I think there's a whole number of reasons. First of all, claret was leaked to the press whilst George was in Washington by Tom Pocock, an Evening Standard journalist. It appeared in the press that Pocock is quoted as, some senior British officers believe it's about time the public knew about this. George was fingered for that. There's a manhunt in Whitehall over it. And George, of course, having been Director of Operations, is unfairly, in my view, you know, one of the people in the radar. And of course, he's in Washington, so it's hard for him to be able to. So that was, you know, there was a question mark there. Did he go too far in stressing to the Americans about hearts and minds? You know, you can't just go in and napalm stuff. You need to talk to people you need to win the trust of people. Did he go too far? Did he upset the Americans? I don't think so. I actually think it, and those two I've just given you, I would discount those. I think it comes down to the very simple fact that George had never served in the British Army of the Rhine. He'd only been there once, and he'd never had a brigade command there, and he'd never had a divisional command there. And of course, we're talking 1970 now, so we're talking about the real threat not being perceived as the Far East, because Britain was pulling out of the Far East and counterinsurgency. We're talking about the massed ranks of Soviet armor that are going to come across the northwest German plain, and George doesn't have experience of that. Personally, I think that's incredibly unfair, because I think he was capable enough that he could have easily and would have put the right team around him. So, you know, the army's a very tribal place, and airborne SAS wasn't everyone's cup of tea. And certainly there were cavalry officers and tank officers who, you know, on paper had much better credentials. So 1970, George says, that's it, I'm off. I'm going to go off and become a civilian. And you can see I put up there his honours. DSO. He got the MBE for serving with the Commando Brigade, actually. I didn't mention that earlier. The Marines loved him. In fact, they wanted to recruit him, but they were told hands off, he's ours by the army. And then his knighthood, which he got from Borneo as a Major General. Very, very unusual for a Major General to get a knighthood. Walter Walker didn't get a knighthood out of Borneo for political reasons, and his Brunei. And so George he joins the city. And it really, really wasn't George at all. So this is the 1970s. You got the lifeboat, you got the Bank of England crisis, and George is really not comfortable with this at all. He's really not enjoying being in the city. The cut and thrust of commerce is just not George. And so he's made Lieutenant of the Tower of London, which he thoroughly enjoys, a ceremonial role, and it keeps him in touch with his old regiment, which has by now become the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. And he's made Deputy Colonel and then becomes Colonel of the regiment. So he manages to keep his ties with the army. But around the mid-1970s, about 75, he decides to retire to Jersey and does all the things that senior retired officers do. He became president of Jersey Scouts Association. In fact, when I was writing the book, I met a couple of men who remembered him as boys, who said George Lee taught us how to start fires out in the woods, you know, from the SAS days. So, you know, people just remember this stuff. He was president of the Royal British Legion, but not just with a bowler hat and a furled umbrella at Remembrance Day. He's counting the money in the back in the factory premises with the ladies, as a proper leader does. And lastly, a little story about him as a shopkeeper. So his wife Pamela set up an interior design business, and George was nominally the chairman, I think, and he just thoroughly enjoyed going out to Italy and buying stuff. And he was encouraged. He'd been the chairman of the Army and Navy Club in London when he'd been in the city, and he'd undertaken a massive refurbishment program there. So when he came to Jersey, there was a very old gentleman's club, old school club called the Victorian Club here, which wanted George to undertake a similar thing. So they encouraged him to apply. So he did. And on the application form where it said name, he just put George Lee. Mr. George Lee, didn't put his rank, didn't put his post-nominals at all. And when it had occupation, he just put shopkeeper. And he just wasn't, this is the kind, he was just self-effacing and humble. He didn't need to put general, retired general. And I'm told that the story goes that when his application came up to the membership committee, the chairman sort of chuffed out his coffee and said, "I'm not having a shopkeeper in this club." At which point, one of the there was a retired army officer said, "Well, actually, he's actually a 3-star knighted general who commanded the SAS and was director of operations in Borneo." So, just an example of George. Here he is in retirement talking to his younger brother, Christopher. And I'm not going to spend too much time on Christopher because I'm writing a book about him at the moment. But he was involved in the first airborne operation of the war, Operation Colossus, where he was captured. They were all captured. He gets the MC for that, but primarily for the intelligence reports he's sending back to his parents in Kidderminster, where the letters, when I'm reading through the family letters, there's some really strange stuff in there where Christopher talks about, do you remember old Mrs. Morton cooking Christmas dinner? And I'm thinking, what the hell is he talking about? And then it dawned on me, actually, this was code. So Christopher was sending coded message from prisoner of war camps back to the War Office, to MI9. But after the war, Christopher leaves the army. He reads the Bible as a prisoner, and he also does his law exams. And after the war, became a barrister, then became a judge. And then at the grand old age of 72, became a curate. So, an equally interesting life, but one probably for another time. So just to finish up there, I'm very conscious of time. I've gone a little bit over here, Paul. Apologies for that.
It's all good.
These are the things that Lee represented. All of these words, all of these adjectives: courage, innovation, diplomacy, humility, integrity, humor, all the things that a good leader in any walk of life need. George had all of these in abundance. I was very lucky that the foreword to my book was written by a gentleman called General Sir Mark Carlton Smith, who's the Colonel Commandant of the SAS. And I think, for me, that closes the chapter on this, because that is General Sir Mark, I think, from the SAS perspective, saying thank you to George. You kept us in the game. The Army count. He doesn't say it in this way, but it's a thank you for keeping the regiment going, keeping it in existence. And there's a lovely little epitaph from one of his obituaries there. George was the type of man who could sack you yet still remain your friend. Isn't that a great way to sum someone up?
Yeah,
willing to take hard decisions about people who he liked, but still being able to do it in a humane way. And finally, here's his headstone in St. Brelard's Bay. Again, no post-nominals, no lieutenant general, just George Harris Lee, 1912 to 1990. Paul, that's it in the sort of formal part from me.
Brilliant stuff. I mean, there aren't many questions because you kind of answer them as you went along. But I mean, I'm just thinking, in terms of the legacy, in that, when he listed himself as a shopkeeper, for example, do you think he was the kind of person who would have been seeing the memoirs of other generals and politicians coming out as they did repeatedly through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and sort of rolling his eyes and thinking, that's not for me to kind of puff my chest out and list all my achievements, even though, as you've made it very clear, he could have equaled or topped most of these biographies with his own achievements. Do you think he was some dismissive of that, or was it just more that he just didn't want to put praise on himself? What?
I don't think it was dismissive, Paul. So he was just very self-effacing, and he, talking to his daughter, she said he never pushed himself forward. You had other officers who were ambitious, who would push themselves forward. George just wasn't like that. He would prefer to let his quality shine through by what he did and how he did it, rather than talking about it. And I think that reflects itself in, he should have written a book, definitely. He should have done, because, he had an incredible life, but very self-effacing, very humble, but a man of presence and a man of charisma.
Thank you. And I think we said right at the beginning, it's that transition from the rather I don't know how to explain it without being to be negative, the kind of the rough instrument the special forces were in World War II, to this more mature, professional organization at the SAS, and then his diplomatic, political, military career beyond that. It's sort of taking the best of your people, like your Paddy Mains and your Johnny Coopers and things like that, those people that just knew how to fight, but melding that with the people perhaps like Shan Hackett, who was more of an organizer as well as a soldier, and then coming out of that with this idea of professionalizing this idea of what special forces is all about, because we all know what that, we all think we know what that phrase means, but it actually means many different things. And it seems to me that George had a very clear idea about how these sorts of forces could be deployed, and took it from all those different places, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So he put the operational bedrock into the SAS, definitely, with the quality of the people he had around him, and in key positions like Woodhouse, Slim, Johnny Cooper, but also, writing a procedures manual that was unheard of. Paddy May and Bill Sterling, David Sterling, none of them wrote. It just wasn't. So for me, it was very much a necessary evolutionary step. It's kind of almost like codifying what you do and how you do it, but recognizing it's a journey. So if you look at the hearts and minds stuff in Malaya and in Borneo as well, that wasn't a feature of the Chindit patrols. They weren't, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert on the Chindits, so I'll defer to anyone who's got better knowledge on it, but I don't think the Chindits were employed in the hearts and minds. They were sent behind Japanese lines to harry, take out key people, disrupt supply lines. They didn't. And so for me, what you see in Malaya is very much an evolution, a next step of how do you do jungle warfare in a more effective way. And definitely, it wasn't George's idea, hearts and minds.
Yeah.
But he very, very much prioritized it. It was an important part of his strategy.
And even the fact that you said, I think, that you think that Borneo was the highlight of his many highlights. Well, when we had Phil Craig on a few months ago talking about, if simplifying it somewhat, the British sort of let down Borneo a little bit in 1944-45. Their promises were made that weren't quite carried out, and yet he's going in there representing the wartime era. He's a wartime serving officer, albeit not in Borneo, but he's now got to sort of smooth the waters over a mixed reputation of British military personnel of his type in Borneo, and coming and rising out of that to, as you say, despite the fact they gave him a severed head, it's the fact they offered him Dennis Healy a gift. He clearly was able to win over people. Despite the fact that the situations he's going into are troubled, as something of an understatement.
So the relationship with the Sultan of Brunei was a key aspect of his role in Borneo, and he did that extremely well. But he just had the charm and the diplomacy to be able to win people over very, very quickly. So that was a key aspect of his role, and I think he left Borneo with a stronger relationship between Britain and Brunei. In fact, I believe there's still a Gurkha battalion paid for by the Sultan of Brunei in Brunei, and that, I wouldn't say that's a direct legacy of Lee's work, but it just shows how he realized quickly the importance of that relationship, the stability of Borneo.
Yeah, and I think we'll leave this with that. I think everybody's had the same realization. The sidebar is that this is someone that they should have known about before. But we're grateful for you for bringing him to our attention. We did the one with Peter Ortiz on Sunday, this OSS chap out in France who did extraordinary things. We were going, why did I not know this story before? He's, as I said at the beginning, he bridges so many different eras and so many different roles, and yet takes the same qualities through them all. He bends with the needs, but he sticks in principle to the guy who joined his county regiment back in the 30s. From my interpretation of how you've told the story, is that he's the same person at the end as he is at the beginning, even though he learns as he goes along. And
you don't need to be an academic to be a leader.
Yeah,
that would be George's. If George's sitting here right now, that would be his messaging. You need presence, you need character.
Well, folks, we will leave it there. I'm not doing anything tomorrow. Then there's a show on Thursday and 2 on Friday. As always, click like and subscribe. And again, the link to the book is in the description below. You can find it wherever you find your books. And I know a few people have already said in the sidebar they're out to purchase it right now. So that's fantastic. So, Rupert, well, you can contact me again when the book about Baby Brother comes out, and we can do the same thing again. But in the meantime, thank you, Rupert. Thank you, viewers. I will see you all again later. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone.